Case 1. Letitia Stoch. In January 2020, 11-year-old Gannon Stoch lived in Colorado Springs with his father, Al Stoch, and his stepmother, Letitia. To the outside world, they appeared to be a typical blended family. Gannon's biological parents had separated, and Al had remarried. Letitia was the woman entrusted with Gannon's care while his father worked. She was supposed to protect him. On January 27, 2020, Letitia called 911 to report that Gannon had not returned home. She told investigators he had left the house that afternoon, sometime between 3:15 and 4 p.m., to walk to a friend's house. He never came back. The initial missing person report described Gannon as a possible runaway, and the community quickly mobilized. Volunteers searched neighborhoods, open spaces, and nearby areas. The FBI Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team joined local law enforcement. Thousands of tips poured in from concerned citizens desperate to bring the boy home safely. But from the beginning, Letitia's story didn't hold up. When police arrived at the house that first night, they discovered she had not visited any neighbors to look for Gannon. She couldn't name a single friend he might have gone to see. She couldn't provide the names of any parents who might know where he was. Investigators noted her behavior was unusual for a frantic guardian searching for a missing child. 3 days after Gannon's disappearance, the El Paso County Sheriff's Office reclassified the case. He was no longer considered a runaway. New evidence suggested he was missing under suspicious circumstances, possibly endangered. The search intensified, but the truth was far darker than anyone initially imagined. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera told a story that contradicted everything Letitia had claimed. The video showed Gannon getting into Letitia's truck on the afternoon of January 27th. Hours later, the footage captured the truck returning. Only Letitia got out. Investigators began to focus their attention on the stepmother who had reported him missing. What had actually happened inside that Colorado Springs home was beyond comprehension. Evidence would later reveal that on January 27th, Letitia Stoch attacked Gannon with methodical brutality. She stabbed the 11-year-old boy 18 times. She shot him in the head. She beat him with a blunt object, likely a baseball bat or the butt of a gun. The attack was not impulsive. It was sustained, violent, and carried out against a child who had no means of defense. After killing Gannon, Letitia did not call for help. She did not confess. Instead, she began an elaborate cover-up that would span multiple states and weeks of lies. She placed Gannon's body in a suitcase. Then she loaded that suitcase into her vehicle and drove. She didn't drive across town or even to a neighboring county. Letitia Stoch drove approximately 1,400 miles from Colorado to Florida, transporting her stepson's remains across state lines. In Florida, under a bridge near Pensacola, she disposed of the suitcase. Gannon's body was discovered weeks later, on March 17, 2020, by workers in the area. The boy who had been reported missing from Colorado Springs was found hundreds of miles away, his remains hidden in a piece of luggage. The discovery confirmed what investigators had suspected and what Gannon's family had feared. He had never walked to a friend's house. He had never run away. He had been murdered by the woman his father had trusted to care for him. Letitia was arrested on March 2, 2020, in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. She was charged with first-degree murder of a child under 12 by a person in a position of trust, among other counts. During the investigation, digital evidence and witness testimony painted a picture of premeditation. Letitia had researched how to cover up a crime. She had lied repeatedly to investigators, changing her story multiple times when confronted with evidence that contradicted her claims. At trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her guilt. The defense pursued an insanity plea, claiming that Letitia suffered from dissociative identity disorder and had multiple personalities with names like Taylor, Jasmine, and Maria Sanchez. According to this defense, it was Maria Sanchez, not Letitia, who had killed Gannon. Mental health experts testified that Letitia claimed these alternate personalities emerged due to childhood trauma involving physical and sexual abuse. The jury was not convinced. After nearly 8 hours of deliberation, they convicted Letitia Stauch on May 8, 2023, of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of tampering with a deceased human body, and 1 count of tampering with physical evidence. The verdict meant the jury had rejected the insanity defense entirely. They found that Letitia knew right from wrong when she killed Gannon, and that her actions afterward, the cross-country drive, the disposal of his body, the elaborate lies, demonstrated consciousness of guilt and clear intent to evade justice. At sentencing, the courtroom heard from those who loved Gannon. His father, Al Stauch, spoke through tears about his failure to protect his son. He told the court he never imagined Gannon would be in danger at home with his stepmother, the last person to see him alive on this earth. He said he was haunted by the knowledge that he had left his child with his murderer. Gannon's biological mother, Landon Bullard Hyatt, also delivered a victim impact statement describing the void that Letitia had created in their lives. Al Stauch asked the judge to strip Letitia of the right to use the Stauch name, saying it was nauseating to hear her called by it. Letitia chose not to make a statement. She sat silently as Judge Gregory Werner addressed her before imposing the sentence. The judge called the evidence against her the most horrific he had ever seen in his career. He detailed the Iaoja brutality of the attack, noting that forensic evidence suggested Gannon had tried to defend himself as Letitia stabbed him 18 times. Werner pointed out the calculated nature of her actions, emphasizing that after killing the boy, she transported his body 1,400 miles and hid it under a bridge. Judge Werner took direct aim at the insanity defense. He called it a disservice and a betrayal to people who truly suffer from mental health conditions. He pointed out that few individuals with mental illness become violent, and fewer still commit murder. He questioned the logic of the multiple personality claim, asking sardonically whether there was ever a moment after the murder when Letitia came out and wondered why she was carrying a body around in her luggage. The judge's implication was clear. Letitia had been fully aware of what she was doing at every stage. Werner sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He added 12 years for tampering with a deceased human body and 18 months for tampering with physical evidence. He concluded by saying her conduct deserved the maximum punishment he could impose under Colorado law. Letitia Stauch was remanded to state custody immediately, where she remains today. The case sent shockwaves through the Colorado Springs community and captured national attention. It highlighted the particular danger children face when the threat comes from inside the home, from someone in a position of trust. Letitia had been the person responsible for Gannon's daily care while his father worked. She was supposed to feed him, help him with homework, make sure he was safe. Instead, she became his killer. For Gannon's family, the trial brought a measure of closure, but it could never restore what had been taken. Gannon was described by those who knew him as a kind, energetic boy who loved to play and spend time with his father. His death at the hands of his stepmother remains a stark reminder of how trust, once broken, leaves devastation in its wake. Even today, the name Gannon Stauch is remembered in Colorado Springs and beyond. Memorials were held in his honor. His family continues to speak about him, ensuring that he is not defined solely by the way he died, but remembered for the child he was. The case forced uncomfortable conversations about how missing children cases are initially classified and how quickly assumptions can obscure the truth. Letitia Stauch will spend the rest of her life in prison, her elaborate lies and desperate insanity defense having failed completely. The jury saw through the claims of alternate personalities and childhood trauma. They recognized what the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated. A stepmother who murdered her stepson, tried to hide the crime, and then attempted to manipulate the justice system to avoid responsibility. Gannon Stock's life was cut short at just 11 years old, but the memory of who he was endures. His case stands as a painful reminder that the most dangerous place for a child is sometimes the place they should be safest, home. Case 2. Gabriel Fernandez. Gabriel Daniel Fernandez was born on February 20, 2005, to Arnold Contreras and Pearl Fernandez. Shortly after his birth, Gabriel was placed in the care of his great-uncle, Michael Lemos Carranza, and Carranza's partner, David Martinez. For the first years of his life, Gabriel was safe, loved, and happy. His great-uncle's family provided the stability and affection every child deserves. But in October 2012, Pearl Fernandez decided she wanted her son back. Against the wishes of Carranza and Martinez, who had grown to love Gabriel as their own, the boy was returned to his mother's custody in Palmdale, California. Pearl lived with her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre, a 32-year-old man who had been in a relationship with Pearl for approximately 2 years. Aguirre had worked as a security guard and previously as a caregiver at a retirement home where staff had described him as kind and gentle. But behind closed doors, away from professional settings, Aguirre was something else entirely. When Gabriel moved into the small Palmdale apartment, he entered what would become 8 months of unimaginable horror. The abuse began gradually but escalated rapidly. Gabriel attended Summerwind Elementary School, and it was his first-grade teacher, Jennifer Garcia, who first noticed something was wrong. Gabriel came to school with visible injuries. He asked her questions about being whipped. Garcia was alarmed enough to make a report to the Child Welfare Hotline. A social worker was assigned to Gabriel's case. Despite this intervention, the abuse did not stop. It intensified. Over the following months, Gabriel's teachers and school staff continued to witness escalating signs of harm. Bruises appeared on his face and body. He seemed withdrawn, fearful, and increasingly malnourished. Each time concerns were raised, reports were filed with the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services. Each time, social workers visited the home, spoke with Pearl and Aguirre, and ultimately took no action to remove Gabriel from the residence. The system that existed to protect him treated his case as manageable, routine, not urgent enough to warrant removal. What was actually happening inside that apartment was beyond routine. It was systematic torture. Aguirre, who stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 270 pounds, subjected the 60-pound boy to daily brutality. Gabriel was beaten repeatedly with belts, fists, and blunt objects. He was shot with a BB gun, the pellets embedding in his skin and lungs. Cigarettes were extinguished on his body, leaving burns across his flesh. He was forced to eat cat feces and cat litter. When he vomited from the abuse and malnutrition, Aguirre forced him to eat his own vomit. The psychological torture was equally devastating. Gabriel was forced to sleep bound and gagged inside a small wooden cabinet. He was made to wear girls' clothing as a form of humiliation. According to prosecutors, one of Aguirre's motivations for abusing Gabriel was his belief that the boy was gay. Aguirre apparently took pleasure in tormenting the child based on this suspicion. Pearl's other children later testified that both Aguirre and their mother would laugh while inflicting the abuse. The cruelty was not just physical, it was meant to break Gabriel's spirit entirely. By December 2014, the abuse had become so severe that school officials at Summerwind Elementary made another report to child welfare authorities. They detailed their concerns about the evident injuries and Gabriel's deteriorating condition. The Manhattan Child Welfare Authorities responded that the concerns were not reportable due to a lack of direct evidence of abuse or neglect. The report was rejected. Shortly after this rejection, Pearl withdrew Gabriel from Summerwind Elementary. She made no effort to enroll him in another school. Gabriel disappeared from the one place where adults had been paying attention. Neighbors in the Palmdale apartment complex knew something was wrong. They heard screaming. Some saw Gabriel with visible injuries. A few reported their concerns to authorities, but no one intervened decisively enough to save him. Gabriel remained isolated in that apartment, cut off from teachers who had cared about him, trapped with two people who tortured him daily. On May 22, 2013, Pearl Fernandez called 911. She reported that her son was not breathing. When Los Angeles County Fire Department paramedics arrived at the apartment in the 200 block of East Avenue Q10, they found Gabriel naked in a bedroom. He was not breathing. His skull was cracked. He had 3 broken ribs. BB pellets were embedded in his lung and groin. His body was covered in bruises, burns, and open wounds. According to testimony from emergency responders, Pearl kept saying, my baby," but her distress seemed performative, not genuine. Gabriel was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was catastrophic. A nurse who treated him, Emily Rebar, later testified that every inch of Gabriel was bruised and swollen, his skin black and blue. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy took 2 full days to document all the injuries. He found multiple rib fractures at different stages of healing on both sides of Gabriel's chest, marks and bruises across his entire body, and bleeding inside his head caused by blunt force trauma. The injuries were not from a single incident. They represented months of sustained, escalating violence. On May 24, 2013, Gabriel Fernandez was taken off life support. He died at the age of 8. The official cause of death was listed as complications from blunt force trauma. But the fuller truth, revealed through the coroner's examination, was that Gabriel had endured severe physiological and emotional distress over an extended period. He had been systematically tortured to death. Pearl Fernandez and Isaro Aguirre were arrested immediately. Both were charged with first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture. Prosecutors pursued the death penalty for both defendants. During police interviews, both Pearl and Aguirre attempted to shift blame. Pearl told deputies she didn't know why Gabriel was in such terrible condition, claiming he had been up all night and she didn't know what he had gotten into. Aguirre gave a videotaped statement, admitting he had caught Gabriel stealing yogurt and decided to punish him by holding his head under running bath water. Investigators suspected Gabriel's head had been smashed against the faucet or bathtub during this punishment, causing the fatal skull fracture. As the case moved forward, public outrage grew. The sheer extent of the abuse was horrifying, but equally disturbing was the revelation that Los Angeles County's child welfare system had received numerous reports about Gabriel and failed to act. Teachers had reported, family members had called, neighbors had expressed concern. Yet Gabriel remained in that home until he died. In response to the public outcry, Los Angeles County District Attorney Jackie Lacey took the unprecedented step of filing criminal charges against 4 employees of the Department of Children and Family Services. 2 social workers, Stephanie Rodriguez and Patricia Clement, and 2 supervisors, Kevin Baum and Gregory Merritt, were charged with 1 felony count each of child abuse and falsifying public records. The charges alleged that these workers had been aware of the abuse but failed in their duty to protect Gabriel. They were accused of lying in official documents about the extent of their contact with the family and the adequacy of their investigation. Isaro Aguirre went to trial in 2017. The trial lasted several weeks, and jurors were presented with graphic evidence of what Gabriel had endured. Prosecutor Jonathan Hatami called Aguirre pure evil and argued that he deserved the death penalty. The defense attorney John Allen attempted to portray Aguirre as a kind man who had never committed a crime before meeting Pearl, suggesting she was the primary aggressor. but the evidence told a different story. On November 15, 2017, the jury convicted Aguirre of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture. After deliberating on the penalty phase, the jury recommended death. On December 13, 2017, Aguirre was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison. Pearl Fernandez avoided trial by accepting a plea agreement. On February 15, 2018, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. At her sentencing hearing on June 7, 2018, Pearl made a brief statement to the court. She said she was sorry for what happened and wished Gabriel was alive. She said she wished she had made better choices and told her surviving children that she loved them. Judge George Lomeli was unmoved. He sentenced Pearl Fernandez to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearings for both defendants, Gabriel's father, Arnold Contreras, testified about the son he had lost. He described Gabriel as an energetic, loving child who liked to play outside, enjoyed games of cops and robbers, and had a bright smile. Contreras expressed deep regret that Gabriel had ever been placed with Pearl. He said he believed Gabriel's maternal grandparents would be caring for the boy, but Pearl and Aguirre had taken him instead. He told the court about the sleepless nights, the permanent grief, the knowledge that his son had suffered and died in terror. Jennifer Garcia, Gabriel's first-grade teacher, also spoke at the sentencing. She described Gabriel as a kind child who liked to help his classmates. She said his abuse and death would haunt her for the rest of her life. She called Pearl and Aguirre evil for what they had done, but added that Gabriel, had he survived, would not have wanted them punished. She said that was the kind of person Gabriel was, forgiving, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The criminal case against the 4 child welfare workers moved more slowly. Defense attorneys argued that the workers could not be held criminally responsible for failures that were systemic rather than individual. In January 2020, an appeals court agreed and dismissed all charges against Rodriguez, Clement, Baum, and Merritt. The court ruled that social workers do not have a legal duty to protect children in the same way that police officers or other direct caregivers might. The decision was controversial and deepened the sense that no one had been held accountable for the system's failure to save Gabriel. The case might have faded from public attention after the criminal proceedings concluded, but in 2020, filmmaker Brian Knappenberger released a 6-part documentary series titled The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez on Netflix. The documentary examined not only the abuse and murder, but also the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. It featured interviews with prosecutors, investigators, teachers, family members, and even footage of court proceedings. The series brought Gabriel's story to a global audience and reignited demands for child welfare reform. In the years following Gabriel's death, California implemented changes intended to strengthen child protection. There were calls for increased staffing, better training for social workers, and more robust protocols for handling reports of abuse. But advocates argued that the reforms were insufficient. They pointed out that Gabriel's case was far from unique. Other children had died under similar circumstances despite contact with Child Protective Services. The documentary included references to other victims, highlighting a pattern of systemic failure rather than isolated incidents. In 2021, Pearl Fernandez attempted to have her conviction vacated and sentence reduced. She filed a petition under California Penal Code 1170.95, which allows individuals convicted of murder under certain theories to seek resentencing. Pearl's attorneys argued that changes to California law in 2019 should apply to her case. Prosecutor Jonathan Hatami opposed the petition, stating that Pearl had been a major participant in the torture and murder of Gabriel and that allowing her to seek resentencing was unfair to the surviving family. On June 1, 2021, Judge George Lomelli denied the petition. He stated that it had been established by Pearl's own admission during her guilty plea that the murder was intentional and involved the infliction of torture over several months. Pearl remains in prison, serving her life sentence. Isauro Aguirre's automatic appeal to the California Supreme Court is still pending as of this writing. He remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Given California's moratorium on executions, it is unlikely he will be executed, but he will spend the remainder of his life behind bars. Gabriel Fernandez's death became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when systems meant to protect children fail. His case forced uncomfortable questions into public discourse. How many reports does it take before a child is removed from a dangerous home? Why are social workers not held accountable when children die on their watch? What happens when bureaucracy, caseload pressures, and institutional indifference combine to render a child invisible? Gabriel's great-uncle, Michael Lemos Carranza, and his partner, David Martinez, who had cared for Gabriel in his early years, were devastated by his death. They had fought to keep him, knowing he would be safer with them. Their warnings were ignored. Gabriel's biological father, Arnold Contreras, lives with the knowledge that he was in jail when his son needed him and that Gabriel was returned to a mother who did not love him. What remains of Gabriel Fernandez is a story that should never have ended the way it did. He was a child who asked his teacher about being whipped, hoping someone would help. He was a boy whose injuries were visible to neighbors and school staff. He was reported, documented, and still abandoned by the very systems designed to intervene. His life mattered. His death demands that we do better. Until the systems meant to protect children are fundamentally transformed, Gabriel's name will remain a reminder of what happens when society fails its most vulnerable. Case 3. Sarah Sharif. Sarah Sharif was born on January 11, 2013, in Surrey, England. She was described by those who knew her as a beautiful little girl, full of personality, who loved to sing and dance. Justice John Kavanaugh, who would later preside over the trial concerning her death, called her a very courageous little girl with an unquenchable spirit. But Sarah's spirit, no matter how strong, could not survive what was inflicted upon her in the home she shared with her father, stepmother, and uncle. Sarah lived with her father, Irfan Sharif, 42, his wife Beinash Batul, 30, and Irfan's brother Faisal Malik, 29, in a house in Woking, Surrey. The family appeared ordinary from the outside, but inside that home, Sarah endured a campaign of abuse that escalated over years until it killed her. Family court records would later reveal that Irfan Sharif had been on the radar of social services for years before Sarah was even born. His former wife, Olga Sharif, had raised concerns about his behavior, yet Sarah and her older brother ended up in his custody after family court proceedings. At school, Sarah's teachers began to notice troubling signs. Bruises appeared on her body, her behavior changed. A teacher reported the bruising to social services, raising concerns that Sarah might be suffering abuse at home. This should have triggered an investigation, protective measures, perhaps even removal from the home. Instead, Irfan Sharif withdrew Sarah from school entirely. He claimed he would homeschool her. Once Sarah was no longer attending school, she disappeared from the view of the adults who had been paying attention. She had no teachers to notice new injuries, no classmates whose parents might ask questions, no daily contact with anyone outside her immediate household. What Sarah experienced in the months and years that followed can only be described as torture. Specialist doctors and pathologists who later examined her body found evidence of approximately 100 separate internal and external injuries. Many of these injuries had been inflicted over an extended period, indicating sustained and repeated violence. Sarah suffered a traumatic brain injury. She had multiple broken bones, including fractures that had healed and then been re-injured, suggesting abuse that went on for months. Her body was covered in extensive bruising and scarring. Among the most disturbing evidence were burn marks. One burn on Sarah's buttocks had been intentionally inflicted using a domestic iron, heated and pressed against her skin. There were human bite marks on her body. Investigators determined that Sarah had been beaten with various implements, including a cricket bat, a vacuum cleaner pole, and a metal pole. The beatings were not impulsive outbursts. They were systematic, deliberate acts carried out with objects chosen to inflict maximum pain. Sarah was also subjected to restraint and suffocation. Evidence showed that homemade hoods had been fashioned from parcel tape and plastic bags. These hoods were placed over Sarah's head while abuse was being inflicted, covering her face and restricting her breathing. The combination of physical beatings, burns, restraint, and psychological terror created an environment of unrelenting cruelty. Sarah lived in fear every day of her short life. On August 8, 2023, it is believed that Sarah died. The exact moment of her death may never be fully known, but August 8th is the date prosecutors identified as most likely. The following day, August 9th, Beinash Batul did something that suggested the household knew Sarah was dead or dying. She booked one-way plane tickets to Pakistan for herself, Urfan Sharif, Faisal Malik, and 5 children in the household. The tickets were for a flight departing the next day. The family left England on August 10, 2023, abandoning Sarah's body in the house in Woking. On August 10th, while the family was in flight or had just arrived in Pakistan, Urfan Sharif made a phone call to Surrey Police in the United Kingdom. He told the operator that he had killed his daughter. He said he had legally punished her, and she died. He admitted he had beat her up too much, but claimed he had not intended to kill her. The call was shocking in its casual admission of fatal violence. Urfan spoke as though excessive punishment was a reasonable explanation, as though his daughter's death was an unfortunate accident rather than the inevitable result of prolonged torture. When Surrey police officers went to the family's home in Woking, they found Sarah's body. She was lying under a blanket in a bunk bed. The post-mortem examination revealed the full extent of what she had endured. The pathologist who conducted the autopsy found the cause of death to be complications arising from multiple injuries and neglect. The sheer number of injuries, around 100 in total, and the variety of methods used to inflict them, painted a picture of systematic, escalating abuse. Sarah had been starved, beaten, burned, bitten, and suffocated. No single injury had killed her. It was the accumulation of violence, the repeated trauma, and the denial of care that caused her small body to fail. In Pakistan, Urfan Sharif, Beinash Batul, and Faisal Malik initially remained out of reach of British law enforcement, but diplomatic efforts and cooperation with Pakistan's Federal Investigation Agency eventually led to their return. More than a month after fleeing, the 3 adults returned to the United Kingdom. On September 13, 2023, they were arrested as they disembarked at Gatwick Airport. All 3 were charged with murder and causing or allowing the death of a child. The trial began at the Central Criminal Court in London, commonly known as the Old Bailey, in October 2024. It lasted 10 weeks and exposed horrific details of Sarah's final months. Prosecutors presented evidence that this was not a case of discipline gone too far or a single moment of violence. It was a sustained campaign of cruelty. The abuse escalated over time, with Sarah subjected to increasingly severe and frequent attacks. Jurors were shown photographs of Sarah's injuries, heard testimony from medical experts, and reviewed evidence of the household dynamics. Urfan Sharif was the only one of the 3 defendants to give evidence. He initially attempted to blame Beinash Batul, claiming she was responsible for Sarah's death. As the trial progressed, he changed his story. At one point, Sharif claimed full responsibility for Sarah's death in what appeared to be an attempt to protect his wife and brother. He admitted he had beaten Sarah, but insisted he had not intended to kill her. He maintained throughout his testimony that he was not responsible for the bite marks or burn injuries. His explanations were inconsistent, self-serving, and ultimately unconvincing. On December 11, 2024, after deliberating the evidence, the jury returned with their verdict. Urfan Sharif was found guilty of murder. Benash Batul was found guilty of murder. Faisal Malik was found not guilty of murder, but was convicted of causing or allowing Sarah's death. The verdicts meant the jury believed Sharif and Batul had directly participated in the violence that killed Sarah, while Malik had been aware of the abuse and failed to intervene or report it. On December 17, 2024, the three defendants appeared for sentencing before Justice John Kavanaugh. The judge addressed each of them, making clear the gravity of what they had done. He described Sarah as a beautiful little girl who was full of personality and courage. He said she loved to sing and dance and had an unquenchable spirit. Then he detailed what Sarah's final months had been like. He called the treatment she endured a culmination of years of neglect, frequent assaults, and what could only be described as torture. Justice Kavanaugh said that judges must be careful about using the word torture, that it should not be overused. But in Sarah's case, he said, the word was appropriate. The degree of cruelty was almost inconceivable. The abuse had been systematic, intentional, and prolonged. He noted that none of the three defendants had shown a shred of true remorse. Urfan Sharif was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years before he would be eligible for parole. Benash Batul was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 33 years. Faisal Malik was sentenced to 16 years in prison. The case sent shockwaves through the United Kingdom and prompted urgent calls for reform. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer called for stronger safeguards for homeschooled children like Sarah. He said there were questions that needed to be answered about how Sarah's abuse had gone undetected and unaddressed for so long. Sarah had been withdrawn from school shortly after a teacher reported concerns. Once she was homeschooled, there was no oversight, no mandatory check-ins, no system in place to ensure she was safe. She became invisible. Rachel D'Souza, the Children's Commissioner for England, issued a statement after the trial calling Sarah's death a heartbreaking reminder of profound weaknesses in the child protection system. She said that, as a country, the United Kingdom had failed time and time again to correct these weaknesses. She pointed out that society had been in this position before: a child dead, a public outcry, promises of reform, and then another child dead. She said each time authorities vowed, "Never again," but the failures continued. Following the trial, family court records were unsealed and revealed that Urfan Sharif and his former wife, Olga Sharif, had been on social services radar 3 years before Sarah was born. There had been concerns about the household, about Urfan's behavior, about the safety of children in his care. Despite this history, Sarah and her brother were placed in his custody. The decision-making process that led to this outcome is now subject to review, but for Sarah, the review comes too late. Detective Chief Superintendent Mark Chapman from the Surrey Police and Sussex Police Major Crime Team, which led the investigation, said the murder of a child is always shocking, but the injuries and abuse Sarah suffered made this case particularly disturbing. He emphasized that a local child safeguarding practice review would be conducted to examine the actions of all agencies involved with the family and to identify lessons that must be learned. The review is meant to determine how the system failed Sarah and what changes are necessary to prevent similar tragedies. Rick Jones, Deputy Director of International at the National Crime Agency, praised the tireless work of officers and international partners in bringing the defendants back to the UK. He said Sarah's life had been taken in truly horrific circumstances at the hands of the very people who were meant to protect and nurture her. He expressed that the agency's thoughts remained with Sarah's mother and those who knew and loved her. Sarah's mother, who had been separated from Irfan Sharif and had not been living with Sarah at the time of her death, attended nearly every day of the trial. The pain of losing her daughter, of learning the details of what Sarah had suffered, was unimaginable. Sarah's mother had not been able to protect her because Sarah was in her father's custody. The family court system had placed Sarah in a home where she would be tortured to death. The case has raised profound questions about the oversight of homeschooled children in the UK. When a child is withdrawn from school, particularly after concerns have been raised, what mechanisms exist to ensure their safety? The answer, as Sarah's case demonstrated, is that the mechanisms are insufficient. There are no mandatory home visits for homeschooled children. There is no requirement that homeschooled children be seen regularly by medical professionals or other mandatory reporters. Once removed from the school environment, a child can effectively disappear. Advocates for child protection reform have called for a register of homeschooled children, regular welfare checks, and stronger protocols for investigating families who withdraw children from school after abuse allegations. These proposals face resistance from some homeschooling advocates who argue that the vast majority of homeschooling families are loving and responsible. But Sarah's case makes clear that without oversight, the small minority of families who homeschool to hide abuse can torture and kill children without detection. Sarah Sharif's life should have been filled with the singing and dancing she loved. She should have grown up, gone to school, made friends, and had the opportunity to become whoever she wanted to be. Instead, she was failed by a family court system that placed her with her abuser, failed by a child protection system that did not follow up after concerns were raised, and failed by a regulatory framework that allowed her to vanish from public view when she was withdrawn from school. Justice Kavanaugh's words at sentencing captured the horror and the tragedy. He said that Sarah's death was the culmination of years of abuse and that the degree of cruelty was almost inconceivable. He said that none of the three defendants had shown true remorse. Irfan Sharif, Beinash Batul, and Faisal Malik will spend decades in prison, but no sentence can undo what was done to Sarah. Even today, Sarah's name is invoked in discussions about child protection reform in the United Kingdom. Her case is compared to other high-profile failures, Victoria Climie, Baby P, Arthur Labinjo Hughes, a litany of children who died despite contact with social services. Each case prompted inquiries, reports, and promises of change. Yet children continue to die. The systems meant to protect them remain fragmented, under-resourced, and unable to prevent tragedies that are, in hindsight, entirely predictable. Sarah Sharif deserved better. She deserved a childhood free from pain and fear. She deserved adults who would protect her, not torture her. She deserved a system that would notice when she disappeared and intervene before it was too late. Her death is a stain on every institution and individual that failed her. Until the United Kingdom and every country takes child protection seriously enough to prioritize it above bureaucratic inertia and systemic indifference, Sarah's name will remain a symbol of what happens when society looks away. Case 4. Shanda van der Ark. Shanda van der Ark was, by conventional measures, an educated and accomplished woman. She had put herself through college and law school, overcoming a difficult childhood marked by trauma. She was intelligent, capable, and had worked hard to build a better life for herself. But in the summer of 2022, authorities in Norton Shores, Michigan, discovered that behind the facade of competence and achievement, van der Ark had been inflicting systematic torture on her 15-year-old son, Timothy Ferguson. Timothy was born with autism and was both speech and motor impaired. He required patience, specialized care, and compassion. He was vulnerable in ways that should have made those around him more protective. Instead, his disabilities made him a target. Timothy lived with his mother, Shanda, and his older brother, Paul Ferguson, who was 19 years old in 2022. The household also included a younger child. But it was Timothy who bore the brunt of Shanda's cruelty. On July 6, 2022, police in Norton Shores responded to a 911 call from the Vander Ark home. When they arrived, they found Timothy unresponsive. Paramedics attempted to revive him, but it was too late. Timothy was pronounced dead. The officers at the scene immediately recognized that something was wrong. Timothy's body weighed only 69 pounds. For a 15-year-old boy, this was severe malnutrition. His appearance was skeletal. Judge Matthew Casel would later compare Timothy's body to that of a Holocaust victim, so extreme was the emaciation. An autopsy was conducted to determine the cause of death. The medical examiner concluded that Timothy had died from malnourishment and hypothermia. His death was ruled a homicide. The findings prompted a deeper investigation into what had been happening inside the Vander Ark home. Detectives discovered that Shanda Vander Ark had installed security cameras throughout the house. She had placed locks on the refrigerator and pantry. These measures were not for general household security. They were specifically designed to monitor and control Timothy. Investigators also found extensive text message exchanges between Shanda and her older son Paul. The messages detailed various forms of punishment being used against Timothy. The texts discussed feeding him hot sauce, subjecting him to ice baths, and forcing him to perform grueling physical exercises. The picture that emerged from these communications was chilling. Timothy was being systematically starved. He was given minimal food, often just pieces of bread. Sometimes the bread was soaked in Carolina Reaper hot sauce, one of the hottest chili peppers in the world. Paul later admitted to investigators that he had poured the hot sauce directly into Timothy's mouth on his mother's orders. The burning sensation would have been agonizing, and for a malnourished child, the forced consumption of such an irritant was another form of torture. Timothy was subjected to ice baths that lasted for hours. Paul testified that on the day before Timothy died, he had been placed in a bathtub filled with cold water for more than 9 hours. The prolonged exposure to cold water caused hypothermia, which contributed directly to Timothy's death. The ice baths were not isolated incidents. They were a regular form of punishment inflicted over months. In addition to starvation and ice baths, Timothy was forced to perform exhausting physical exercises. Text messages revealed that he was made to run up and down stairs while Paul chased him. He was forced to hold positions like wall sits and one-legged stands for extended periods, sometimes for 12 hours or more. These exercises, combined with severe malnutrition, would have been excruciating. Timothy's body was already weakened from lack of food. The forced exertion pushed him beyond what his small frame could endure. At night, Timothy was not allowed to sleep in a bed. He was confined to a small closet in the basement. Detectives who examined the closet found it contained only a blue tarp and an Amazon box. The space had an overwhelming odor of urine and feces. Timothy was sometimes restrained with handcuffs and zip ties. Motion sensors and cameras monitored his movements, even in the bathroom. Every moment of Timothy's life was controlled, surveilled, and filled with suffering. Paul Ferguson was charged alongside his mother. Prosecutors alleged that while Shanda orchestrated the abuse, Paul carried it out. During police interviews and later court testimony, Paul claimed he was following his mother's orders. He said his low self-esteem made him desperate to make her proud, and that he complied with her instructions even when he knew they were harmful. Paul testified that he had noticed Timothy was getting dangerously thin. He said he took pictures of Timothy's emaciated body and sent them to his mother, trying to hint that the starvation needed to stop. But he did not call authorities. He did not tell other family members. He continued to participate in the abuse. On the morning Timothy was found dead, Paul said he attempted to resuscitate him for 18 minutes before calling 911. He claimed that Shanda told him to lie to police and say Timothy had been on a hunger strike. Paul initially followed this script when speaking to officers. Later, he changed his story and confessed the full truth to investigators. Shanda Vander Ark was arrested and charged with open murder and first-degree child abuse. Her trial began in October 2023 in Muskegon County Circuit Court. Over the course of the trial, jurors heard from Paul Ferguson, who had agreed to testify against his mother as part of a plea agreement. They read the extensive text messages between Shanda and Paul. They saw photographs of Timothy's body and the conditions in which he had been forced to live. Shanda took the stand in her own defense. She claimed she did not remember many details of the days, weeks, and months leading up to Timothy's death. Her attorney, Fred Johnson, argued that Shanda had not intended to kill Timothy. He said that something broke in her mentally due to her own history of abuse and that she did not understand the damage she was causing. Johnson portrayed his client as a woman who had overcome significant trauma in her own life, physical and sexual abuse at the hands of her father and later her stepfather, but who had been overwhelmed by the challenges of raising a special needs child. The prosecution rejected this narrative entirely. Deputy Prosecutor Matt Roberts argued that Shanda had systematically tortured Timothy. He pointed to the security cameras, the locked food storage, the detailed planning evident in the text messages. He noted that Shanda had hidden Timothy from his grandparents and other family members. She closed the garage doors when making him perform punishments so neighbors would not see. When she had considered forcing Timothy to drink salt water as a punishment, she relented, not because it would hurt him, but because she did not want to give him an excuse to sit on the toilet with diarrhea. Every decision Shanda made was calculated to maximize control and minimize detection. On October 26, 2023, after deliberating for just over an hour, the jury found Shanda Vander Ark guilty of felony murder and first-degree child abuse. She was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She had become ill earlier in the proceedings after being shown photographs of Timothy's body, and the judge ruled she was not required by law to be present for the verdict. Sentencing took place on January 23, 2024. Timothy's older siblings, Millie Joan Ferguson and Eric Nolan Ferguson, Jr., delivered victim impact statements. Millie said she regretted not putting aside her differences with her mother and Paul just to check on Timothy. She said there was no fixing what had been done, and she wanted the world to know that Timothy was wanted and loved, if not by his mother, then by her. Nolan spoke about having to leave his career behind, about watching his wife suffer as he struggled daily with the knowledge that he had not known what was happening. He asked the court to impose the maximum sentence, saying that if he could not have his brother back, his mother should not have her freedom back. Before imposing sentence, Judge Matthew Cassell addressed Shanda Vander Ark directly. He said he had spent the entire case trying to understand how someone could do something so horrific, not only to another human being, but to their own child. He called what had happened to Timothy systematic torture. He said Shanda had acted knowingly, even if she claimed not to have intended Timothy's death. He noted that she had hidden Timothy from people who cared about him, that she had taken deliberate steps to conceal the abuse, and that her justifications revealed a lack of genuine remorse. Cassell sentenced Shanda Vander Ark to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the felony murder conviction. He also sentenced her to 50 to 100 years for first-degree child abuse, exceeding the sentencing guidelines because of Timothy's long-term suffering. Both sentences were credited with 575 days for time already served. Shanda was remanded to state custody, where she remains today. Paul Ferguson's sentencing took place on February 26, 2024. He had pleaded guilty to first-degree child abuse in December 2023. At his hearing, Paul addressed the court, asking for mercy and fairness. He said he wanted compassion so he might learn. But Judge Casel was skeptical. He told Paul that he did not believe he was truly sorry. He said Paul lacked empathy and emotion, and that scared him. Casel compared Paul to his mother, saying he thought Paul was just as bad, if not worse. The judge rejected the argument that Paul had simply been following orders. He pointed out that Paul could have gone to a neighbor and reported the abuse. He could have taken Timothy and gotten him out of the house. He could have called authorities. Instead, Paul participated actively in the torture of his own brother. Casel expressed concern that Paul would not receive adequate help in prison and might pose a danger to the public upon release. Paul Ferguson was sentenced to 30 to 100 years in prison, with credit for 592 days already served. The sentence ensures that Paul will spend decades behind bars and possibly the rest of his life, depending on parole decisions far in the future. The case received significant attention in Michigan and beyond. Muskegon County Prosecutor D.J. Hilson called it the most disturbing case he had seen in his career. The involvement of the older brother, the educated background of the mother, and the sheer extent of the suffering inflicted on Timothy made the case particularly harrowing. It challenged assumptions that abuse happens only in uneducated or impoverished households. Shonda Vander Ark had the intelligence and resources to raise her son with care. She chose torture instead. For Timothy's surviving siblings, the case left permanent scars. They carry the guilt of not having known, of not having intervened, of not having been able to protect their little brother. Nolan Ferguson said at sentencing that he wondered if he had told Timothy he loved him enough times for Timothy to remember until the very end. Millie Ferguson said she wanted everyone to know that Timothy was wanted, that he mattered, that his life had value beyond the suffering inflicted upon him. Timothy Ferguson is remembered not for the torture he endured, but for the person he was. He was a child with special needs who deserved patience and love. He was a brother who was missed. He was a human being whose life was stolen by those who should have protected him. His death exposed the reality that education, intelligence, and outward respectability are no guarantees against the capacity for cruelty. Shonda Vander Ark and Paul Ferguson will spend the remainder of their lives in prison. The small closet, the ice baths, the starvation, the surveillance, all of it has been documented, judged, and condemned. But for Timothy, justice came too late. He died alone, cold, starving, and in pain, in a house where cameras watched his every move, but no one came to save him. Case 5. Monique Osuna. Emric Osuna was just 9 years old when he came to live with his father, Eric Osuna, and stepmother, Monique Osuna, in Meridian, Idaho, in February 2018. The move was meant to be a fresh start, a safe harbor for a child who had already experienced trauma. Emric's biological mother had been sent to prison for severely abusing his younger siblings. Authorities determined that Emric needed to be removed from her care and placed with his father. The decision was made with the best intentions, to protect a vulnerable child from further harm. But in leaving one abusive home, Emric walked directly into another. At first, things seemed hopeful. In a statement later read during her plea hearing, Monique Osuna described Emric as a sweet little boy who fit in well with the family. Eric and Monique had other children in the household, and initially, Emric appeared to be adjusting. But according to Monique, Emric began displaying what she called concerning behaviors. She did not specify what those behaviors were, but she claimed they prompted her to begin physically punishing him. What started as discipline escalated into systematic torture that would last more than 2 years. Monique installed nanny cameras throughout the apartment. Ostensibly, these cameras were meant to monitor the children and ensure their safety. But the footage captured by those cameras would tell a different story. They documented not the protection of children, but the sustained abuse of one child in particular. The very devices Monique had installed to watch over her household became the evidence that would convict her of murder. Over the months and years that followed Emmerich's arrival in Idaho, Monique subjected him to brutal and relentless violence. She withheld food and water, leaving the 9-year-old boy malnourished and weak. She beat him with a variety of objects: a belt, a frying pan, a dog leash. The beatings were not occasional outbursts of anger. They were regular, methodical, and severe. The nanny camera footage showed Monique kicking Emmerich across the room with such force that his small body flew through the air. She yanked him off his feet by his hair, dragging him and inflicting pain that would have been excruciating for a child already weakened by starvation. In addition to the physical beatings, Monique forced Emmerich to perform grueling exercises for hours on end. She made him hold wall sits, a position that strains the legs and becomes unbearable after even a few minutes. She forced him to stand on one leg for extended periods. She made him do exercises called inchworms, where he would move his body forward in a crawling motion, and jumping jacks that went on until exhaustion set in. These exercise sessions lasted for 12 hours or more. For a malnourished child, the physical exertion was torture. Emmerich's body, already deprived of adequate nutrition, was pushed beyond its limits. At night, Emmerich was not allowed to sleep in a bed. He was forced to sleep in a closet, isolated from the rest of the family. This confinement was another form of control and punishment, a way to ensure Emmerich understood he was separate, unwanted, and subject to Monique's absolute authority. The nanny camera footage captured these acts of cruelty in disturbing detail. Investigators who reviewed the footage saw hours of abuse. They saw Monique calling Emmerich names, threatening him, and physically assaulting him while other members of the household went about their lives. Eric Osuna, Emmerich's biological father, was also seen on the footage. Prosecutors later alleged that while Eric abused Emmerich far less frequently than Monique, he failed to intervene. He witnessed his wife torturing his son and did nothing to stop it. He did not call the police. He did not remove Emmerich from the home. He participated in some of the abuse and enabled the rest through his silence and inaction. On September 1, 2020, paramedics were called to the Osuna apartment in Meridian. They arrived to find Emmerich lying emaciated and unconscious in the living room. His small body was dangerously thin, his condition critical. He was rushed to a local hospital, but the damage was too severe. Emmerich Osuna died shortly after arrival. He was 9 years old. The medical examiner who conducted the autopsy concluded that Emmerich had died from the cumulative effects of starvation, dehydration, and physical abuse. His body bore the marks of prolonged violence. He was severely malnourished. His organs had begun to fail. The official cause of death was listed as injuries sustained from chronic abuse and neglect. Monique Osuna and Eric Osuna were both arrested. Monique was initially charged with felony child endangerment, and Eric was charged with attempted murder. After Emmerich's death, the charges were upgraded. Both were charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors alleged that the couple had systematically tortured Emmerich, depriving him of food and water, beating him, and forcing him to endure hours of physical punishment until his body could no longer sustain life. As the case moved forward, the nanny camera footage became the centerpiece of the prosecution's evidence. The videos were played in court, and those who watched them were left shaken. Court officers passed out tissues to jurors who wept as they viewed the abuse. The footage showed a pattern of cruelty that was undeniable. It was not a matter of interpretation or conflicting testimony. The cameras had recorded everything. Monique's own decision to install the cameras had created an incontrovertible record of her crimes. In December 2021, Monique Osuna entered a guilty plea. She pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, acknowledging her role in Emmerich death. In a statement read during the plea hearing, Monique said she was sorry for what had happened. She said that, at first, Emmerich had seemed like a sweet little boy who fit in well, but that, after a while, he started displaying concerning behaviors. She claimed she began to physically punish him in response. She wrote, "Before I knew it, I was abusing him." The statement was an admission of guilt, but it offered little explanation for the escalation from discipline to torture, from punishment to murder. Monique Osuna was sentenced to life in prison. The judge made clear that the abuse Emmerich suffered was not the result of momentary lapses in judgment. It was sustained, deliberate, and cruel. The nanny camera footage left no room for claims of accident or misunderstanding. Monique had tortured Emmerich methodically, and the cameras she installed had documented every moment. She was remanded to the Idaho Department of Correction, where she remains today. Eric Osuna, Emmerich's biological father, also faced charges. Prosecutors argued that he was complicit in the abuse, that he had seen what was happening and failed to protect his son. Eric pleaded not guilty and maintained his plea as his case moved toward trial. As of the most recent information available, Eric's trial was scheduled for April 2022. Though delays and legal proceedings have extended the timeline, he remains charged with first-degree murder and felony injury to a child. The evidence against him includes the nanny camera footage showing him participating in some of the abuse and failing to intervene during the rest. The case drew significant attention in Idaho and beyond. The fact that the abuse had been captured on video made it particularly harrowing. There was no ambiguity, no question of what had happened. The cameras had recorded a little boy being tortured to death over the course of years. The footage showed Emmerich's suffering in painful clarity. It showed a child who had no escape, no advocate, no one willing to save him. Emmerich's story is made even more tragic by the context in which he came to live with Eric and Monique. He had been removed from his biological mother's care because she had abused his younger siblings. Child Protective Services had intervened, recognizing that the children in that household were in danger. Emmerich was placed with his father, presumably because authorities believed he would be safer there. But the system that removed Emmerich from one abusive environment failed to protect him in the next. No follow-up visits ensured his well-being. No mandatory check-ins monitored how he was adjusting. He was placed with his father and stepmother, and then he was forgotten. The case highlighted the failures of a child welfare system that often focuses on initial placement but provides inadequate oversight afterward. Emmerich had been identified as a victim of abuse. He was a child who had already experienced trauma. He should have been monitored closely with regular visits and assessments to ensure his new living situation was safe. Instead, he was left in a home where his stepmother beat him daily and his father stood by and watched. For those who reviewed the nanny camera footage, the images were impossible to forget. Investigators, prosecutors, and court personnel who viewed the videos described them as some of the most disturbing evidence they had ever encountered. The footage showed a small boy being kicked, dragged, beaten, and forced to perform exercises until he collapsed. It showed him being denied food while he grew thinner and weaker. It showed a child suffering, and it showed two adults inflicting that suffering without mercy. Monique Osuna's statement during her plea hearing, "Before I knew it, I was abusing him," offered no real insight into how someone goes from disciplining a child to torturing him to death. The statement suggested a gradual escalation, a loss of control, but the evidence painted a different picture. The abuse was not impulsive. It was planned, repeated, and sustained. Monique made the decision to beat Emmerich every day. She made the decision to withhold food. She made the decision to force him to perform exercises for 12 hours. She made the decision to kick him across the room, to yank him by his hair, to call him names, and threaten him. Each of those decisions was deliberate. Eric Osuna, as Emmerich biological father, had a responsibility to protect his son. He had fought to gain custody. He had brought Emmerich into his home, and then he had allowed his wife to torture the boy to death. Even if Eric did not personally inflict the majority of the abuse, his failure to intervene made him complicit. He was present. He saw what was happening. He had the power to stop it, to call the police, to remove Emmerich from danger. He chose not to. Emmerich Osuna's life was marked by tragedy from the beginning. He experienced abuse at the hands of his biological mother. He was removed from her care and placed with his father, only to experience even worse abuse at the hands of his stepmother. He spent his final years hungry, beaten, isolated, and in pain. He died at 9 years old, his body so emaciated and damaged that he could no longer survive. The nanny cameras that documented Emmerich's torture serve as a grim reminder that evidence of abuse is not always enough to stop it. The cameras captured everything, but they did not save Emmerich. No neighbor saw the footage and called the police. No family member checked in and discovered what was happening. The cameras simply recorded, preserving a visual history of suffering that would only be seen after Emmerich was already dead. Monique Osuna is serving a life sentence in Idaho. She will never be free. Eric Osuna awaits his day in court, facing charges that could result in a similar fate. But for Emmerich, justice came too late. He endured years of torture, and when he finally died, it was in a home where cameras watched his every moment of suffering, but no one came to help. Emmerich Osuna deserved better. He deserved a childhood free from violence. He deserved adults who would protect him, not torture him. He deserved a system that would follow up after his placement and ensure he was safe. Instead, he was failed by every person and every institution that should have saved him. His death is a reminder that removing a child from one dangerous situation is only the first step. Without ongoing oversight and genuine commitment to child safety, vulnerable children remain at risk. For Emmerich, that risk became a reality, and it cost him his life. Case 6. Maricela Garcia. In February 2021, authorities in China Spring, Texas, near Waco, received a report that led them to a rural home on Wortham Bend. What they discovered there was a child living in conditions that shocked even the most experienced officers and child protection professionals. A young girl, who would be identified in court documents only as KV, was found living in a backyard shed. She was malnourished, covered in scratches and bruises, and showed clear signs of prolonged abuse and neglect. The girl was approximately 12 years old. She had been living in that shed, subjected to systematic torture, for 6 years. KV was the stepdaughter of Maricela Garcia, 47, who was married to the girl's father, Juan Olvera Velázquez, 33. KV had come to live with her father and Garcia when she was around 5 or 6 years old. For the first year, things seemed manageable. KV later testified that she had been happy living with her father until he got together with Garcia. Initially, Garcia treated her well enough. But once the relationship solidified and Garcia established herself in the household, everything changed. Garcia began treating KV with escalating cruelty. She told the child that she would never be loved or accepted in the family. She told KV that Velázquez was not really her father, undermining the girl's sense of belonging and security. The psychological abuse was relentless. Garcia made it clear that KV was unwanted, that she was a burden, that her existence was a problem to be managed rather than a life to be nurtured. The physical abuse followed quickly. Garcia beat KV regularly, using whatever objects were at hand. The beatings left bruises, welts, and scars. But the physical violence was only part of the torment. Garcia forced KV to live in a shed in the backyard. The shed was filthy, unheated, and offered no protection from the elements. KV was made to sleep there night after night, isolated from the rest of the family, separated from any warmth or comfort. In the Texas heat of summer and the cold of winter, KV lived in that shed, alone and afraid. Garcia forced KV to eat from a dog bowl, treating the child like an animal rather than a human being. The food provided was minimal and inadequate. KV was malnourished, her growth stunted by years of insufficient nutrition. Garcia threatened KV constantly, telling her that if she tried to escape or tell anyone what was happening, she would be killed. The threats were not idle. KV believed them. She was a small child, completely dependent on the adults around her, with no means of escape and no reason to believe anyone would help her. The psychological warfare Garcia waged against KV extended beyond threats of violence. Garcia encouraged the child to commit suicide. She told KV that her life was worthless, that she would be better off dead, that no one would miss her. For a child already isolated, beaten, and starving, these messages were devastating. KV was being told daily that she had no value, no future, and no hope. The intent was clear, to break the child's spirit so completely that she would never resist, never tell, never try to leave. Inside the main house, Garcia had 2 younger daughters with Velasquez. These children were not subjected to the same treatment as KV. They slept in beds, ate at the table, and were cared for in ways that KV was not. The disparity made Garcia's cruelty even more pointed. KV could see that other children in the household were treated with basic decency, while she was forced to live in a shed and eat from a dog bowl. The message was unmistakable. KV was different, lesser, unworthy of the care given to Garcia's biological children. Juan Olvera Velasquez, KV's biological father, was present throughout the 6 years of abuse. He saw his daughter living in the shed. He saw her eating from a dog bowl. He saw the bruises and the scratches. He heard Garcia threatening and berating KV. And he did nothing. He did not intervene. He did not report the abuse. He did not protect his daughter. His inaction made him complicit in every beating, every threat, every night KV spent alone in that filthy shed. In February 2021, something changed. Authorities became aware of KV's situation, though the exact circumstances of how they were alerted remain unclear from public records. When investigators arrived at the home, they found KV in the shed. She was emaciated, covered in injuries, and clearly traumatized. At first, KV told authorities that the scratches and marks on her body were from dogs and cats. She had been conditioned to lie to protect her abusers, to avoid making things worse for herself. But when counselors, Child Protective Services workers, and sheriff's deputies assured KV that she would not be returning to that home under any circumstances, she began to tell the truth. The floodgates opened. KV overwhelmed the professionals with horrific tales of torture and abuse. She described the beatings, the starvation, the threats, the years spent in the shed. She spoke about being told she was worthless, about being encouraged to kill herself, about being forced to eat from a dog bowl while Garcia's biological children ate at the table. The timing of KV's rescue proved to be life-saving in more ways than one. Just days after she was removed from the Garcia home, Texas was hit by Winter Storm Uri, a catastrophic weather event that brought freezing temperatures, widespread power outages, and dangerous conditions across the state. Millions of Texans lost electricity and heat. The storm was deadly, causing hundreds of deaths, many from hypothermia and related causes. If KV had still been living in that unheated backyard shed during Uri, she almost certainly would not have survived. Prosecutors later noted that divine intervention seemed to have played a role in the timing of KV's rescue, saving her life just days before conditions that would have killed her. Child Protective Services removed KV from the home immediately. She was placed in foster care and eventually reunited with her biological mother. Garcia's 2 younger daughters, her biological children, with Velasquez, were also removed from the home. Velasquez relinquished his parental rights to KV, severing any legal connection to the daughter he had failed to protect. A judge terminated both Velasquez's and Garcia's parental rights to the two younger girls. Maricela Garcia was arrested and charged with 2 counts of injury to a child, 1 first-degree felony and 1 second-degree felony. The charges reflected the prolonged nature of the abuse, and the severity of the harm inflicted on KV Garcia was held in McLennan County Jail as her case moved through the legal system. The trial took place in Waco's 19th State District Court in January 2025. Prosecutors Will Hicks and Jessica Washington presented evidence of the 6 years of torture KV had endured. They called witnesses who described the conditions in which KV had been found. They presented medical evidence of malnutrition and physical abuse. They detailed the psychological torment Garcia had inflicted, including the threats, the encouragement to commit suicide, and the constant message that KV was unloved and unwanted. KV herself testified. Now 15 years old and preparing to turn 16, she took the stand and faced her abuser. She described her experience living with Garcia, the years of abuse, and the fear that had dominated her childhood. Her testimony was powerful and courageous. She had survived 6 years of torture and was now strong enough to stand in a courtroom and tell the truth about what had been done to her. The jury, composed of 8 men and 4 women, deliberated for less than 15 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Garcia was convicted on both counts, first-degree felony injury to a child and second-degree felony injury to a child. The speed of the deliberation reflected the overwhelming evidence of Garcia's guilt. There was no question about what had happened, no ambiguity about who was responsible. The sentencing phase followed. The same jury deliberated for about 40 minutes before recommending that Judge Thomas West impose the maximum sentence on both counts. The jury's recommendation was clear. Garcia deserved the harshest punishment available under Texas law. At the sentencing hearing, KV gave a victim impact statement. She spoke directly to Garcia, addressing the woman who had tortured her for 6 years. KV said she had prayed every day to be able to escape the torture and abuse. She said she had told herself she would probably be held captive in that house until she turned 18, that she had no hope of freedom before then. She looked at Garcia and said, "You always told me no one would believe a little girl, but they did and still do." KV continued, expressing a sentiment that was both forgiving and firm. She said she hoped Garcia would repent while in jail for what she had done. She said the sentencing marked a new beginning in her own life, and that Garcia would now have to live with the consequences for the rest of hers. The courtroom erupted in applause, an unusual reaction to a victim impact statement, but one that reflected the profound respect and admiration for KV's courage. KV later explained that she had written many angry things she intended to say to Garcia, but had decided not to say them. She had chosen instead to focus on her own future, on the new beginning that was now possible because Garcia would be locked away. The maturity and grace KV displayed at such a young age, after enduring such horror, moved everyone present. Judge Thomas West sentenced Maricela Garcia to life in prison on the first-degree felony count and 20 years on the second-degree felony count. He also imposed fines totaling $20,000. The life sentence means Garcia will never be eligible for parole. She will spend the rest of her life in prison, removed permanently from society and from any opportunity to harm another child. After the sentencing, McLennan County District Attorney Josh Tetens issued a statement. He said that divine intervention had led them to the moment where a child who had suffered horrific trauma and torture watched as a jury sentenced her abuser to life in prison, exactly 4 years to the day after she had been rescued. Tetens emphasized that nothing compares to the wholly unnecessary abuse of innocent children, and that his office would continue to seek maximum sentences for those who inflict such harm. He said the jury had sent a clear message to abusers throughout the county. You will be held responsible and face the consequences. Prosecutors Hicks and Washington echoed these sentiments, noting that KV's rescue just days before Winter Storm Uri had likely saved her life. They said that had she still been in that unheated shed during the storm when temperatures plummeted and power grids failed, she would not have survived. KV is now living with her biological mother, building a life free from the torment she endured for 6 years. She has received counseling and support to help her heal from the trauma. She is in school, making friends, and experiencing what childhood should have been all along. Her survival is a testament to resilience, and her willingness to testify against Garcia demonstrated a courage far beyond her years. The case drew significant attention in Texas and highlighted the vulnerability of children in blended families, particularly when one parent enables or ignores abuse by a step-parent. Velasquez's failure to protect his daughter was as damning as Garcia's active cruelty. He had a responsibility to KV, and he abdicated it entirely. His relinquishment of parental rights was a legal formality that recognized what had been true all along. He was not a father to KV in any meaningful sense. The 6-year duration of KV's captivity and torture raises painful questions about how a child can suffer so visibly for so long without intervention. KV was not hidden away in a locked basement. She was in a backyard shed, visible to anyone who looked. Neighbors lived nearby. Extended family members existed, yet no one reported the abuse until 2021. The isolation and control Garcia exerted over KV was effective enough to keep the child silent and invisible for 6 years. Garcia's sentence ensures she will never have the opportunity to harm another child. She will live out her days in a Texas prison, her freedom permanently revoked. For KV, the sentence represents justice, validation, and safety. The woman who told her no one would believe a little girl was wrong. KV was believed, she was rescued, and her abuser was held fully accountable. Maricela Garcia's cruelty was not impulsive or accidental. It was calculated, sustained, and cruel. She isolated a vulnerable child, subjected her to years of physical and psychological torture, and attempted to break her spirit so completely that she would never tell. But KV did tell. She survived. She testified. And she stood in a courtroom and watched as her abuser was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison. KV's story is one of unimaginable suffering, but it is also one of survival and courage. She endured 6 years of horror and emerged with the strength to confront her abuser and reclaim her life. The applause that filled the courtroom after her victim impact statement was not just for what she had survived, but for who she had become despite it all, a young woman who refused to let Garcia's cruelty define her future. Case 7. Sebastian Kalinowski. Sebastian Kalinowski was 15 years old when he left Poland in October 2020 to live with his mother, Agnieszka Kalinowska, in Huddersfield, England. It should have been an opportunity for a fresh start, a chance to build a relationship with his mother and experience life in a new country. Instead, it became the final chapter of a short life that would end in unimaginable suffering. Sebastian spoke little English. He had grown up in Poland and was not fluent in the language of his new home. This language barrier, combined with his unfamiliarity with British culture and systems, made him completely dependent on the adults around him. He had no friends in England, no extended family to turn to, no teachers or social connections who might notice if something was wrong. Sebastian was isolated from the moment he arrived. His mother, Agnieszka Kalinowska, was 36 years old and living with her boyfriend, Andrzej Latoszewski, 38, in a house on Leeds Road in Huddersfield. Latoszewski had become Kalinowska's partner, and when Sebastian arrived, he moved into a household where this man held significant authority. The dynamics of the home quickly became toxic. Sebastian, vulnerable and isolated, became the target of systematic abuse that would escalate over the 10 months he lived there. Sebastian was homeschooled. He did not attend a local school where teachers might have noticed injuries or changes in behavior. He did not participate in community activities where other adults might have interacted with him. He was kept within the confines of the home, cut off from any meaningful contact with the outside world. Investigators would later describe Sebastian as having lived an isolated life, one in which he had nowhere and no one to turn to. He could not speak the language well enough to seek help. He did not know how to navigate British institutions or understand his rights. He was trapped. Kalinovska and Latoshevsky subjected Sebastian to systematic torture. They beat him repeatedly, inflicting injuries that covered his body. The violence was not hidden or concealed out of shame. In fact, Kalinovska and Latoshevsky documented some of the abuse themselves. They used their phones to record videos of the attacks, capturing footage of Sebastian being beaten and humiliated. They also exchanged text messages discussing the abuse, describing what they had done to him, and planning further violence. The messages were casual, even joking at times, as though tormenting a teenage boy was a form of entertainment. The abuse escalated over time. What may have started as harsh punishment became sadistic violence. Sebastian was denied adequate food. He was subjected to prolonged physical attacks that left him bruised, battered, and weakened. The psychological torment was equally severe. He was verbally abused, belittled, and made to feel worthless. In a foreign country where he could not speak the language, where he had no friends and no support system, Sebastian had no escape. He could not call for help. He could not run away. He was entirely at the mercy of two people who showed him none. Investigators who later reviewed the evidence described the abuse as wicked and evil. Detective Chief Inspector Tony Nicholson of the Homicide and Major Inquiry Team, who led the police investigation, said it was without doubt the most harrowing case he had experienced in his 29 years as a police officer. He said Sebastian could not have been more isolated and appeared to have suffered the most appalling abuse in silence. Nicholson noted that Sebastian seemed to have come to see the abuse as normal, a heartbreaking indication of how completely his spirit had been broken. On August 13, 2021, less than a year after Sebastian had arrived in England, emergency services were called to the home on Leeds Road. Sebastian had been found unresponsive. Paramedics attempted to revive him, but it was too late. Sebastian Kalinowski was pronounced dead. He was 15 years old. The cause of death was determined to be the result of the sustained abuse and neglect he had suffered. His body bore the evidence of months of violence. He was malnourished, covered in injuries, and showed signs of prolonged physical trauma. Medical examiners concluded that the abuse had been systematic and severe, inflicted over an extended period until Sebastian's body could no longer survive. Agnieszka Kalinowska and Andrzej Latoshevsky were arrested and charged with murder. As the investigation unfolded, detectives recovered overwhelming evidence of their guilt. The phone footage showed them attacking Sebastian. The text messages documented their discussions about the abuse. The forensic evidence from Sebastian's body corroborated every allegation. There was no ambiguity, no room for claims of misunderstanding or accident. Kalinowska and Latoshevsky had tortured Sebastian to death, and they had documented much of it themselves. The trial took place at Leeds Crown Court. Over the course of the proceedings, jurors were presented with the evidence of Sebastian's suffering. They watched the videos. They read the text messages. They heard testimony from investigators who described the conditions in which Sebastian had lived and the injuries he had sustained. The prosecution argued that Kalinowska and Latoshevsky had abused Sebastian in a manner that was wicked and evil, that they had acted together to inflict sustained cruelty on a child who had no means of defending himself or escaping. The defense attempted to mitigate the charges, but the evidence was too strong. The videos and messages made it impossible to deny what had happened. On November 3, 2022, the jury returned with their verdict. Agnieszka Kalinowska was found guilty of murder, neglect, and causing or allowing the death of a child. Andrzej Latoszewski was found guilty of the same charges. Sentencing took place the same day. Justice John Kavanaugh presided over the hearing and addressed both defendants before imposing their sentences. He described the abuse Sebastian had suffered as inhuman and said the level of cruelty was almost beyond comprehension. He noted that Sebastian had been a vulnerable child, newly arrived in a foreign country, unable to speak the language, and completely dependent on his mother and her boyfriend. Instead of protecting him, they had subjected him to relentless violence and neglect. Agnieszka Kalinowska was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 39 years before she would be eligible for parole. Andrzej Latoszewski received the same sentence, life with a minimum of 39 years. The sentences reflected the severity of their crimes and the prolonged nature of Sebastian's suffering. Both were remanded to custody immediately, where they remain today. The case sent shockwaves through the Huddersfield community and across the United Kingdom. The idea that a teenage boy had been tortured to death by his own mother and her boyfriend within less than a year of arriving in the country was almost unfathomable. The fact that Sebastian had been isolated, homeschooled, and cut off from any support systems raised urgent questions about how such abuse could go undetected. Detective Chief Inspector Tony Nicholson spoke publicly after the sentencing. He reiterated that the case was the most harrowing he had encountered in nearly 3 decades of police work. He said Sebastian had been a child who could not have been more isolated, and that he appeared to have suffered appalling abuse in silence, even coming to see it as normal. Nicholson expressed that the investigative team had recovered overwhelming evidence of the attacks, including footage and messages that upset even experienced detectives. He said he might never know why Kalinowska and Latoszewski had chosen to act in such an inhuman way. The case highlighted the particular vulnerability of children who arrive in a new country without language skills, social connections, or knowledge of local systems. Sebastian had no way to seek help. Even if he had wanted to report the abuse, he did not know how to access police, social services, or other protective agencies. He did not attend school where teachers might have noticed his injuries and intervened. He was homeschooled, isolated, and trapped in a home where the 2 adults who should have cared for him instead tortured him. The evidence that Kalinowska and Latoszewski had documented their own abuse raised disturbing questions about their mindset. Why would someone record videos of themselves beating a child? Why would they send text messages discussing the violence? The behavior suggested a level of arrogance and cruelty that went beyond typical domestic abuse. It indicated they believed they were untouchable, that no one would intervene, that Sebastian's isolation was so complete that they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. Sebastian Kalinowski's death is a tragedy compounded by the fact that it was entirely preventable. He was a child who left Poland with the hope of a better life with his mother. He arrived in England with no knowledge of what awaited him. Within 10 months, he was dead, killed by the 2 people who should have protected him. The sentencing brought a measure of justice, but it could not restore what had been taken. Sebastian's life was cut short at 15. He never had the chance to learn English fluently, to make friends in his new country, to attend school and discover his interests, to grow into the person he might have become. He spent the final months of his life in fear and pain, isolated and helpless. Agnieszka Kalinowska and Andrzej Latoszewski will spend decades in prison. At a minimum, they will serve 39 years before even being considered for parole, and given the nature of their crimes, parole may never be granted. They will grow old behind bars, their freedom permanently forfeited as a consequence of the inhuman cruelty they inflicted on a vulnerable child. For those who investigated the case, the memories of Sebastian's suffering will not fade. The videos and messages that documented the abuse are evidence that cannot be unseen. The knowledge of what Sebastian endured and the fact that he had no one to turn to haunts everyone who worked to bring his killers to justice. Sebastian Kalinowski deserved safety, love, and the opportunity to build a life in his new country. He deserved a mother who would care for him and protect him. He deserved adults who would recognize his vulnerability and ensure he was supported as he adjusted to life in England. Instead, he was tortured, isolated, and killed. His death is a stark reminder of how precarious safety can be for children who find themselves dependent on abusive adults with no external oversight or support. The case has prompted discussions in the UK about the oversight of homeschooled children, particularly those who are newly arrived from other countries. Sebastian was homeschooled and therefore invisible to teachers and school officials who might have noticed his injuries. Once removed from any institutional setting, he had no contact with mandatory reporters or protective systems. He existed in a bubble of isolation where abuse could escalate unchecked. Advocates for child protection have argued that cases like Sebastian's demonstrate the need for mandatory welfare checks on homeschooled children, particularly when those children are known to be vulnerable or have recently arrived from other countries. Without such checks, children like Sebastian can disappear entirely, their suffering hidden from view until it is too late. Sebastian Kalinowski's name now joins the list of children failed by the systems meant to protect them. He came to England seeking a better life and found only suffering and death. His mother and her boyfriend, the people who should have ensured his safety, instead became his torturers and, ultimately, his killers. The sentences they received ensure they will spend the majority, if not all, of their remaining lives in prison. But for Sebastian, justice came too late. He died alone, in pain, in a country that should have protected him, but never knew he needed help. Case 8. David Cox. In May 2010, in a small home in Mississippi, a nightmare unfolded that would shock even hardened law enforcement officers. David Neal Cox, a 50-year-old man, carried out an act of violence so depraved that it would haunt everyone who learned of it. He murdered his wife, Kim Kirk Cox, and sexually assaulted his 12-year-old stepdaughter 3 times as her mother lay dying, even as police officers surrounded the home, desperately trying to end the standoff and save the hostages inside. The horror of that day did not come without warning. Kim Kirk Cox's daughter, whose name has been protected due to her status as a minor victim of sexual assault, had previously reported abuse to authorities. She had told officials that her stepfather, David Cox, had been abusing her. Cox was arrested based on these allegations, but he was released, and upon his release, he made explicit threats. He told both his wife and stepdaughter that if he ever got the chance, he would harm them for reporting him. Those threats were not empty words. Cox meant every one of them. When Cox was released from custody, Kim Kirk Cox and her daughter lived in fear. They knew what he was capable of. They knew he blamed them for his arrest. They knew he had promised retribution. Despite these known threats, despite the documented history of abuse, Cox was free. And in May 2010, he acted on the threats he had made. Cox arrived at the home where Kim and her daughter were staying. He was armed and determined. He forced his way inside and took control of the situation. Kim Kirk Cox tried to protect her daughter. She tried to reason with Cox, to de-escalate, to find a way out, but Cox had not come to talk. He had come to punish. He shot Kim multiple times. As she lay on the floor, bleeding and dying, Cox turned his attention to her 12-year-old daughter. With police officers surrounding the house, shouting through bullhorns and trying to negotiate, Cox sexually assaulted the child. He assaulted her once. Then, as her mother continued to die in front of her, he assaulted her again, and a third time. The girl was trapped in a room with her stepfather, watching her mother bleed to death while being subjected to repeated sexual violence. She could hear the police outside. She knew they were trying to help, but they could not reach her in time to stop what Cox was doing. Eventually, the standoff ended. Police were able to enter the home. Kim Kirk Cox was beyond help. She had succumbed to her injuries. Her daughter was alive, traumatized beyond measure, but alive. David Cox was arrested and taken into custody. The case against Cox was overwhelming. There was no question about what he had done. He had murdered his wife in front of witnesses and law enforcement. He had sexually assaulted his stepdaughter while police listened from outside the home. The evidence was incontrovertible. Cox was charged with capital murder and multiple counts of sexual assault. What happened? Next was unusual. David Cox pleaded guilty. He admitted to shooting and killing Kim Kirk Cox. He admitted to sexually assaulting his stepdaughter 3 times as Kim lay dying. He made no attempt to deny his actions, to claim innocence, or to present a defense. He stood before the court and acknowledged what he had done. Cox was sentenced to death. In Mississippi, capital murder, murder committed during the course of another felony, such as sexual assault, is eligible for the death penalty. Given the circumstances of Cox's crimes, the prosecution sought the maximum penalty, and the court agreed. Cox was sent to death row at the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman. Typically, defendants sentenced to death spend years, sometimes decades, pursuing appeals. They challenge the conviction, the sentence, the procedures followed during trial, and any number of other legal issues. The appeals process is lengthy and complex, designed to ensure that no one is executed without exhaustive review. But David Cox did something rare. He waived his appeals. He declared that he was worthy of death and asked the state to carry out his execution. In July 2018, Cox wrote directly to the trial court judge. His letter, riddled with spelling errors, expressed a desire to have his execution carried out swiftly. He wrote that if he had his way, he would dig up his dead wife and kill her again. The letter was a chilling demonstration of Cox's complete lack of remorse. He was not sorry for what he had done. He was not seeking forgiveness or redemption. He was defiant, cruel, and eager to embrace the death sentence he had been given. The Mississippi Capital Post-Conviction Council, CPCC, which provides legal representation to death row inmates, attempted to continue appeals on Cox's behalf. They argued that Cox might not be competent to waive his appeals, that he might be suffering from diminished mental capacity that prevented him from making a fully informed decision. But the Mississippi Supreme Court reviewed the matter and ruled on October 21, 2021, that Cox was competent. The court found that he had voluntarily and intelligently waived his right to appeal and that his decision to end his life should be respected. Cox's execution was scheduled for November 17, 2021. As the date approached, there were no last-minute appeals, no stays of execution, no legal maneuvers to delay the inevitable. Cox had made his choice, and the state was prepared to carry it out. On the day of the execution, Cox was served his requested final meal: fried catfish, French fries, and banana pudding. Mississippi Department of Corrections Commissioner Burl Cain noted that Cox had been upbeat in the days leading up to his death, an observation that spoke to Cox's lack of remorse and his acceptance of his fate. Among the witnesses present at the execution was Kim Kirk Cox's daughter, the stepdaughter Cox had assaulted. She was now 23 years old. She had lived with the trauma of that day for more than 11 years. She had survived her mother's murder and her own assault. She had testified, cooperated with prosecutors, and watched as Cox was sentenced to death. And now she had chosen to be present for his execution. She wanted to see justice done. She wanted to witness the end of the man who had destroyed her childhood and taken her mother's life. At 6 p.m. on November 17, 2021, David Neal Cox was led into the execution chamber at the Mississippi State Penitentiary. He was strapped to a gurney, and intravenous lines were inserted into his arms. The execution protocol called for 3 drugs to be administered: midazolam, a sedative, vecuronium, bromide, a paralytic, and potassium chloride, which stops the heart. Cox was given the opportunity to make a final statement. He looked toward the witnesses and spoke. "I want to tell my children that I love them very, very much, and that I was a good man at one time," he said, "and only read the King James Version of the Bible, and I appreciate the commissioner for being so nice to me. That's all I got to say." The drugs were then introduced into Cox's system. Officials reported that the process proceeded without incident. Cox was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. Commissioner Kane said afterward that Cox had died peacefully and without incident. For Kim Kirk, Cox's daughter, the execution brought a measure of closure. She had watched the man who killed her mother and assaulted her take his final breaths. She had seen justice carried out. In the years since that terrible day in May 2010, she had worked to rebuild her life, to process the trauma, and to find a way forward. The execution did not erase what had happened. It did not bring her mother back. But it meant that David Cox would never hurt anyone else, and that his life had ended as a consequence of his actions. The case is notable not only for the brutality of Cox's crimes, but also for his decision to waive his appeals and accept execution. Most death row inmates fight their sentences for as long as possible, exhausting every legal avenue to delay or overturn their convictions. Cox did the opposite. He acknowledged his guilt, accepted his sentence, and asked the state to execute him. His letter to the judge, in which he expressed a desire to kill his wife again, demonstrated a complete absence of remorse or humanity. Cox's crimes were among the most heinous in Mississippi's history. The combination of murder and child sexual assault, carried out in the presence of law enforcement, with the victim's mother dying in front of her, represented a level of depravity that shocked investigators and prosecutors. The fact that Cox had been previously arrested for abuse, had made explicit threats, and then carried them out highlighted failures in the system that released him despite the known danger he posed. Kim Kirk, Cox's daughter, had shown extraordinary courage in reporting the initial abuse, in surviving the events of May 2010, and in cooperating with the prosecution. She had endured trauma that most people cannot imagine. She had lost her mother in the most horrific way possible. She had been assaulted repeatedly while her mother died. And yet she had found the strength to testify, to see the case through to conviction, and ultimately to witness Cox's execution. The case also raised questions about the effectiveness of protective measures for victims who report abuse. Kim Kirk Cox's daughter had reported Cox's abuse. Authorities had arrested him, but he was released, and he made good on his threats. The system that should have protected Kim and her daughter failed them. By the time police surrounded the house on that day in May 2010, it was too late. Kim was dying, and her daughter was being assaulted. The officers outside could hear what was happening, but they could not intervene quickly enough to prevent it. David Neal Cox's execution was one of the rare cases where a defendant actively sought death and waived the appeals process. His lack of remorse, his expressed desire to harm his victims again, and his acceptance of execution made him unusual among death row inmates. Most defendants, even those who are clearly guilty, fight their sentences. Cox did not. He admitted his guilt, accepted responsibility, and asked to be executed. For the survivor, Cox's execution marked the end of a chapter that had dominated more than a decade of her life. She had been 12 years old when Cox murdered her mother and assaulted her. She was 23 when she watched him die. In the intervening years, she had grown up, sought therapy, and worked to rebuild her life. The execution did not erase the past, but it provided a finality that allowed her to move forward knowing that Cox was gone. David Cox's crimes were acts of pure evil. He murdered a woman who had once been his wife. He sexually assaulted her 12-year-old daughter not once but 3 times while the child's mother lay dying. He did all of this while police surrounded the home, trying desperately to end the situation and save the hostages. Cox's actions that day were calculated, cruel, and designed to inflict maximum trauma on his victims. The fact that Cox later waived his appeals and asked to be executed suggests he understood the magnitude of what he had done and believed death was the appropriate consequence. Or perhaps he simply wanted control over his fate, preferring to dictate the timing of his death rather than spend decades on death row. His motivations are ultimately unknowable, but his crimes are not. They were documented, witnessed, and judged. Kim Kirk Cox lost her life trying to protect her daughter. Her daughter survived but carries the scars of that day with her forever. David Cox paid for his crimes with his life, executed by the state of Mississippi in a process he himself requested. Justice was served, but the cost was immeasurable. A mother was dead, a child's innocence was destroyed, and the memories of that terrible day in May 2010 remain, a reminder of what happens when evil is allowed to act and when systems fail to protect the most vulnerable. Case 9. Gavin Peterson. On July 9, 2024, emergency responders in West Haven, Utah, were called to a home where they found a 12-year-old boy unresponsive. The child was Gavin Peterson, and by the time help arrived, it was too late. Gavin was pronounced dead. An investigation into his death would reveal that he had been starved so severely that his organs had shut down completely. His small body, deprived of adequate nutrition for an extended period, had simply stopped functioning. He weighed far less than a healthy child his age should, his frame emaciated, and his system failing from prolonged malnutrition. Gavin lived with his father and stepmother, Rosie Scott, in the West Haven home. Scott had married Gavin's father and assumed a parental role in the household, but rather than caring for Gavin, Scott subjected him to systematic neglect and abuse. Text messages recovered from family members' phones revealed disturbing conversations about Gavin. The family discussed beating the boy. They discussed not feeding him. These were not momentary lapses in judgment or expressions of frustration. They were deliberate, coordinated decisions to deprive Gavin of food and subject him to physical violence. The extent of the deprivation was staggering. Gavin was given only small servings of water and a piece of bread with water. That was the sum of his sustenance in the days leading up to his death. No proper meals, no adequate nutrition, just minimal amounts of water and bread, barely enough to keep a child alive, and ultimately not enough to sustain life at all. Gavin's body, starving and desperate for nutrients, began to break down. His organs, unable to function without proper fuel, shut down one by one until his system collapsed entirely. What made Gavin's death even more tragic and more infuriating was that it was not unexpected. It was not a case of hidden abuse that no one could have known about. The Utah Division of Child and Family Services had received multiple reports over several years about Gavin being abused. People who saw Gavin, who interacted with the family, who suspected something was wrong, had reported their concerns to the very agency designed to protect children like him. And yet, Gavin remained in that home. He remained with the people who were starving him, beating him, and discussing his abuse in casual text messages. He remained until he died. The reports to Child and Family Services should have triggered investigations. They should have resulted in home visits, interviews with Gavin, assessments of his safety, and potentially his removal from the home. The specifics of what actions, if any, were taken in response to those reports became the subject of an investigation after Gavin's death. What was clear was that whatever interventions occurred, they were insufficient. Gavin was not saved. He was not removed. He died in the same home where people had suspected, reported, and documented concerns about his welfare for years. After Gavin's death, law enforcement conducted a thorough investigation. They obtained search warrants for the family's phones and digital devices. The text messages they discovered were damning. The conversations between family members showed a pattern of deliberate abuse and neglect. They discussed withholding food from Gavin. They discussed physical punishment. The messages were evidence of premeditation, of ongoing cruelty, of a household in which a child's suffering was acknowledged and perpetuated. Rosie Scott was arrested and charged with child abuse homicide. The charge reflected the fact that Gavin's death had resulted from ongoing abuse and neglect, not from a single incident or accident. He had been systematically starved until his body failed. Scott was held in custody as the case moved through the legal system. In the months following Gavin's death, prosecutors reviewed the evidence and consulted with Gavin's biological mother, who was represented by Utah Homicide Survivors, a law firm that advocates for victims' families in criminal cases. The decision was made to offer Scott a plea agreement. The charge would be amended from child abuse homicide to murder, but in exchange, Scott would plead guilty and avoid a trial. Gavin's mother, through her legal representation, approved the plea deal. The decision was likely made to spare the family the trauma of a lengthy trial and to ensure a conviction without the uncertainty of a jury verdict. On April 8, 2025, Rosie Scott appeared in court and pleaded guilty to murder. By entering the guilty plea, she admitted responsibility for Gavin's death. She acknowledged that her actions, or more accurately, her deliberate inactions, had caused Gavin to starve to death. The plea hearing was brief, focused on ensuring that Scott understood the charges and the consequences of her plea. She was scheduled to be sentenced on May 12, 2025. As of this writing, that sentencing has not yet occurred, and Scott remains in custody, awaiting the hearing. The case has drawn significant attention in Utah and beyond, not only because of the brutality of Gavin's death, but because it represents yet another failure of the child protection system. Gavin Peterson's name has been added to a long list of children who died despite being known to child welfare authorities. Gabriel Fernandez in California, Timothy Ferguson in Michigan, Victoria Climier in England. The names accumulate case after case, jurisdiction after jurisdiction, a litany of children who were reported, investigated, and ultimately abandoned by systems that were supposed to save them. After Gavin's death, an investigation was launched into how the Utah Division of Child and Family Services had handled the reports about him. What actions had been taken? Had caseworkers visited the home? Had they interviewed Gavin alone, away from his abusers, to give him a chance to disclose what was happening? Had they assessed his physical condition, his weight, his overall health? Had they considered removing him from the home when reports continued to come in over several years? The findings of that investigation revealed systemic failures. The details have not been fully disclosed publicly due to confidentiality laws that protect child welfare records, but the fact that Gavin died in a home that had been the subject of multiple reports over several years speaks for itself. Something in the system did not work. Caseworkers were either overwhelmed, inadequately trained, or operating under policies that prioritized keeping families together over removing children from dangerous situations. Whatever the reasons, the result was the same. Gavin was not protected. Utah, like many states, has struggled with its child welfare system for years. Caseworkers are often overloaded, managing far more cases than best practices recommend. Turnover is high as the work is emotionally taxing and the pay is often low. Investigations can be superficial, with caseworkers relying on the word of parents rather than conducting thorough assessments. And there is a cultural and legal bias toward keeping families intact, even when doing so puts children at risk. In Gavin's case, the bias toward family preservation may have been a factor. If caseworkers visited the home and saw that Gavin's father and stepmother seemed cooperative, if the house was clean and the other children appeared fine, if Scott and her husband denied the allegations and provided explanations, the caseworkers may have closed the case and moved on to the next one. This pattern is repeated in jurisdiction after jurisdiction. Reports come in, investigations are cursory, families provide reassurances, and caseworkers, lacking the time, resources, or authority to dig deeper, accept those reassurances and move on. But Gavin was not fine. He was being starved. He was being beaten. He was the subject of text message conversations in which his family casually discussed withholding food from him. And over time, the malnutrition became so severe that his organs began to fail. By the time he was found unresponsive on July 9, 2024, his body had reached a point of no return. Medical professionals who examined him determined that he had been starved to the point where his organs shut down completely. There was no single moment of violence that killed Gavin. It was the slow, deliberate process of denying him the food he needed to survive. Gavin Peterson was 12 years old when he died. He should have been in school, playing with friends, discovering his interests, and growing into adolescence. Instead, he spent his final months, perhaps years, hungry, weak, and in pain. He lived in a home where his stepmother controlled whether he ate, where his suffering was discussed in text messages as though it were a minor inconvenience rather than a life-threatening crisis. The fact that this case occurred in 2024, more than a decade after the deaths of Gabriel Fernandez, Elisa Izquierdo, and so many other children who died despite being known to Child Protective Services, demonstrates that the reforms implemented after those tragedies have been insufficient. Task forces have been convened, reports have been written, policies have been updated, training has been enhanced. And yet, children continue to die. The systems meant to protect them remain broken, overwhelmed, or ineffective. Rosie Scott will be sentenced in May 2025. The prosecution is expected to seek a significant prison term, potentially life in prison, given that she pleaded guilty to murder. The sentencing hearing will likely include victim impact statements from Gavin's biological mother and other family members who loved him and are now left to mourn him. They will have the opportunity to address the court, to speak about who Gavin was and what his loss means to them. They will also have the chance to confront Scott, to tell her what her actions have taken from them. But no sentence will bring Gavin back. No amount of prison time for Rosie Scott will undo the months or years of starvation he endured. No investigation into the failures of child and family services will restore Gavin's life. He is gone. Another child failed by adults who were supposed to care for him and by systems that were supposed to intervene when those adults failed. Gavin's case is a stark reminder that the problem of child abuse deaths is not confined to the past. It is not something that has been solved by previous reforms or policy changes. It is ongoing. Right now, in jurisdictions across the country, there are children living in dangerous homes, children whose abuse has been reported to authorities, children who are hoping that someone will save them. Some of those children will be saved. Others, like Gavin, will not. The question that haunts every case like this is, what will it take? How many children have to die before the systems meant to protect them are adequately funded, staffed, and empowered to act decisively? How many reports have to be ignored or inadequately investigated before policies are changed to prioritize child safety over family preservation? How many more names will be added to the list of children who were known to child welfare authorities but died anyway? Gavin Peterson's death in 2024 is proof that the answers to those questions have not yet been found. His case will lead to calls for reform in Utah, just as Gabriel Fernandez's case led to calls for reform in California, and Timothy Ferguson's case led to calls for reform in Michigan. There will be investigations, reports, and promises to do better. and perhaps some changes will be made. But unless those changes are fundamental, unless they address the chronic underfunding of child welfare agencies, the overwhelming caseloads of social workers, and the systemic bias toward keeping families together even when children are at risk, then it is only a matter of time before another Gavin Peterson dies in another jurisdiction. Rosie Scott's guilty plea means there will be no trial, no public airing of all the evidence, no opportunity for a jury to hear the full story of what Gavin endured. The plea deal approved by Gavin's mother likely reflects a desire to avoid the trauma of a trial and to ensure a conviction. But it also means that some details may remain private, some questions may go unanswered, and the full extent of the failures that led to Gavin's death may never be fully exposed. What is known is this: Gavin Peterson was a 12-year-old boy who was starved to death by his stepmother while his father stood by. The abuse was reported multiple times to the agency responsible for protecting children, and Gavin remained in that home until he died. His death, like so many others, was preventable, and his name, like so many others, will now be invoked whenever people discuss the failures of child protection systems. Gavin's sentencing hearing in May 2025 will provide some measure of justice and closure for his family, but it will not answer the larger questions his death raises. It will not explain why a system that was designed to save children like him failed so completely, and it will not prevent the next tragedy unless serious, systemic changes are made. Until then, Gavin Peterson's death stands as evidence that despite decades of high-profile cases, despite reforms and investigations and promises, children are still dying in homes where their abuse has been reported and nothing has been done to save them. Case 10. Dante Lucas. Dante Lucas was 6 years old and a member of the Heskayat First Nation when he died in 2018. His death occurred in Heskayat Territory, British Columbia, in a home where he had been living for only 4 months. Dante had been removed from a foster home and returned to the care of his mother, Reichel Charlson, and his stepfather, Mitchell Frank. The decision to reunite him with his mother was made with the hope that family reunification would be in Dante's best interest. Instead, within 4 months of his return, Dante was dead, killed by the prolonged abuse and cruelty inflicted by the two people who were supposed to care for him. Dante's story is impossible to separate from the broader context of Indigenous child welfare in Canada. For generations, Indigenous children have been removed from their families and communities at disproportionate rates, a legacy that traces back to the residential school system and continues today through child welfare interventions. In response to this history and in recognition of Indigenous communities' right to care for their own children, some provinces have delegated child welfare authority to Indigenous agencies. In British Columbia, Usma Nucha Nulth Family and Child Services is one such agency, responsible for providing guardianship and care for Indigenous children in the region. When Dante was placed in foster care, it was Usma Nucha Nulth Family and Child Services that oversaw his case. The agency made the decision to remove him from his foster home and return him to his mother and stepfather. The rationale for this decision was not made public due to privacy laws surrounding child welfare cases, but the intent was likely to reunify Dante with his family, as is often prioritized in Indigenous child welfare practice. The goal is to keep Indigenous children connected to their families, communities, and culture whenever possible. But in Dante's case, the reunification was catastrophic. Reichel Charlson and Mitchell Frank subjected Dante to prolonged abuse and cruelty. The specific details of what Dante endured have not been fully disclosed publicly, but the fact that both Charlson and Frank were ultimately charged and convicted of manslaughter indicates that the abuse was severe and sustained, leading directly to Dante's death. According to Graham Hughes, a spokesperson for the Lucas family, Dante's death and the tortures he went through were no secret. The implication was clear. People knew or suspected what was happening to Dante, but no one intervened in time to save him. Dante lived with his mother and stepfather for 4 months. 4 months in which he should have been safe, cared for, and protected. 4 months in which the systems meant to oversee his welfare should have been checking in, ensuring that the reunification was successful, and monitoring for any signs of abuse or neglect. But those systems failed. Dante remained in a home where he was being harmed, and by the time authorities were alerted or intervened, it was too late. Dante Lucas, a 6-year-old child, was dead. After Dante's death, both Reichel Charlson and Mitchell Frank were arrested and charged. Initially, the charges may have been more serious, but as the case progressed through the legal system, both defendants entered into plea agreements. They pleaded guilty to manslaughter, acknowledging their responsibility for Dante's death while avoiding a trial on more severe charges, such as murder. The plea deals likely reflected a combination of evidentiary considerations, the desire to spare the family the trauma of a trial, and the complexities of proving the specific intent required for a murder conviction. The sentencing hearing took place on May 16, 2024, in Port Alberni. Justice David Crossan of the British Columbia Supreme Court presided over the proceedings. Before imposing sentence, Crossan heard arguments from both the prosecution and the defense. He considered the serious nature of the crimes, the prolonged abuse and cruelty that Dante had suffered, and the vulnerability of a young child in a relationship of trust. But he also considered what he described as powerful Gladue factors. Gladue is a landmark 1999 decision by the Supreme Court of Canada that requires judges, when sentencing Indigenous offenders, to pay particular attention to the circumstances of those offenders. The decision recognizes that Indigenous people in Canada have been subjected to systemic discrimination, the legacy of colonialism, the trauma of residential schools, and ongoing socioeconomic disadvantages. Gladue requires judges to consider these factors and to explore alternatives to incarceration, where appropriate, in an effort to achieve sentences that are truly fit and proper in the context of an Indigenous offender's life circumstances. Justice Crossan noted that both Reichel Charlson and Mitchell Frank were members of Indigenous communities and that their lives had been shaped by the legacy of colonialism and the lasting impact of residential schools. The court heard that both came from broken homes and difficult childhoods. Both had struggled with substance use and addiction. These factors, under Gladue, were relevant to sentencing. They did not excuse what Charlson and Frank had done to Dante, but they provided context for understanding the circumstances that had shaped their lives. Justice Crossan sentenced both Reichel Charlson and Mitchell Frank to 15 years in prison for manslaughter. With credit for time already served while awaiting trial and sentencing, they each faced approximately 12 more years in federal prison. The sentences were significant, but fell short of what some might have expected for the death of a 6-year-old child. The application of Gladue factors, combined with the manslaughter plea rather than a murder conviction, resulted in sentences that balanced accountability with recognition of the systemic factors that had affected the offenders' lives. The sentencing sparked difficult conversations within Dante's family and the broader community. Graham Hughes, speaking on behalf of the Lucas family, said that while the sentencing brought some closure, it also left many questions unanswered. The family wanted to know where the failures had happened and how they had happened. They wanted accountability not just from Charlson and Frank, but from the systems that had been responsible for Dante's safety. Dante had been in foster care, presumably because authorities had determined he was not safe with his mother. Then he was returned to his mother's care. Within 4 months, he was dead. What assessments were done before the reunification? What monitoring occurred after Dante was returned home? Were there home visits? Were there check-ins with Dante away from his mother and stepfather where he might have disclosed abuse? Were there any signs, any red flags, any indications that the reunification was not going well? And if there were such signs, why was nothing done? These questions were directed at Usma Nucha Nolth Family and Child Services, the delegated Indigenous child welfare agency that had overseen Dante's case. They were also directed at the Ministry of Children and Family Development, the provincial government agency that delegates authority to organizations like USMA and is ultimately responsible for ensuring that child welfare functions properly. Hughes emphasized that the family's questions were not about assigning blame to individuals, but about understanding systemic failures. They wanted to know how a child could be returned to a home known to have issues serious enough to warrant foster placement, and then die within 4 months without anyone intervening. The intersection of Indigenous child welfare and the legacy of colonialism makes Dante's case particularly complex. For decades, Indigenous children in Canada were removed from their families en masse, placed in residential schools, where they were subjected to abuse and cultural genocide, or adopted out to non-Indigenous families, where they lost connection to their communities and identities. This history has left deep scars. Indigenous communities understandably want control over their own child welfare, want their children to remain connected to their families and culture, and want to avoid the destructive patterns of the past. But delegating child welfare authority to Indigenous agencies does not automatically solve the problem. These agencies face the same challenges as any child welfare system: inadequate funding, heavy caseloads, difficult decisions about when to remove children and when to reunify families, and the inherent difficulty of predicting which homes are safe and which are not. In Dante's case, the agency made a decision to return him to his mother. That decision, made with limited resources and imperfect information, ended in tragedy. The application of Gladue factors at sentencing also reflects the complexity of seeking justice in cases involving Indigenous offenders. Gladue recognizes that Indigenous people have been subjected to systemic harm and that their overrepresentation in the criminal justice system is a direct result of colonialism, residential schools, poverty, and discrimination. It asks judges to consider these factors and to seek sentences that are restorative rather than purely punitive where possible. But for Dante's family, the application of Gladue may have felt inadequate. Their 6-year-old child was dead. He had been tortured and killed by his mother and stepfather. The fact that those offenders had themselves been victims of colonialism and systemic harm did not bring Dante back. It did not undo the suffering he had experienced, and it resulted in sentences, 15 years, with 12 remaining to be served, that may have seemed insufficient given the gravity of what had been done. Justice Crossan's sentencing decision attempted to balance these competing considerations. He acknowledged the serious nature of the crimes and the vulnerability of the victim. He recognized the prolonged abuse and cruelty, but he also recognized the powerful Gladue factors that shaped the lives of Charlson and Frank. The result was a sentence that fell between the extremes of leniency and maximum punishment, an attempt to achieve what the law considers a fit and proper sentence in all the circumstances. Reichel Charlson and Mitchell Frank are now serving their sentences in federal prisons in Canada. They will be eligible for parole before the end of their sentences, depending on their behavior in prison and assessments of their risk to reoffend. Dante's family will live with his loss for the rest of their lives, while his killers will eventually have the possibility of freedom. Dante Lucas was a member of the Hesquiat First Nation, a community with a history, a culture, and a connection to the land. He was a child who should have been raised within that community, learning his language, participating in cultural practices, and growing up surrounded by the traditions of his people. Instead, he was placed in foster care, returned to an unsafe home, and killed within 4 months. His death is both a personal tragedy for his family and a broader indictment of systems, both indigenous and provincial, that failed to protect him. The questions Dante's family raised about systemic failures have not been fully answered. Without a public inquiry or comprehensive review, the details of how decisions were made in Dante's case remain largely confidential. Privacy laws that protect child welfare records, while important for protecting children and families in general, also mean that when systems fail, the public may never know exactly what went wrong. What is known is that Dante was removed from foster care and returned to his mother. What is known is that within 4 months he was dead from prolonged abuse and cruelty. What is known is that his death was no secret, suggesting that people were aware or suspicious of what was happening. And what is known is that no one intervened in time to save him. Dante Lucas's name now joins a long list of Indigenous children who have died in the care of or after contact with child welfare systems in Canada. The overrepresentation of Indigenous children in foster care, the legacy of residential schools, and the ongoing impacts of colonialism create a context in which Indigenous children remain vulnerable. Efforts to address this vulnerability by delegating child welfare authority to Indigenous agencies are well-intentioned, but they are not a panacea. Without adequate resources, training, and systemic support, these agencies face the same challenges and failures as any other child welfare system. Dante's death raises fundamental questions about how to balance the goal of keeping Indigenous children connected to their families and communities with the imperative to protect children from abuse. There are no easy answers. Family reunification is often the right goal, but it must be done carefully with adequate support and monitoring. Indigenous control over child welfare is important, but it must come with sufficient funding and resources. And the application of Gladue factors at sentencing is legally required and morally justified, but it must be balanced with accountability for harm done to victims. For Dante Lucas, all of these systemic considerations came too late. He was 6 years old when he died. He had his whole life ahead of him. He should have had the chance to grow up, to learn about his culture, to become part of his community, to discover who he wanted to be. Instead, he spent the final 4 months of his life being abused and tortured by his mother and stepfather in a home he should never have been returned to. Rachel Charlson and Mitchell Frank have been held accountable through the criminal justice system. They pleaded guilty, they were sentenced, and they are now in prison. But the systems that failed Dante, the child welfare agencies, the decision-makers, the monitoring mechanisms, have faced less clear accountability. Calls for reviews and answers continue, but without transparency and a willingness to confront systemic failures honestly, the same mistakes are likely to be repeated. Dante Lucas deserved better. He deserved a system that would protect him, adults who would care for him, and a life in which he could thrive. His death is a reminder that good intentions, whether in the form of family reunification policies or delegated Indigenous child welfare, are not enough. Without adequate resources, careful assessment, and ongoing monitoring, children remain at risk. And when systems fail, it is children like Dante who pay the price with their lives. These 10 cases reveal a devastating pattern. Children entrusted to step-parents' care become invisible victims of unimaginable cruelty, while the systems designed to protect them fail repeatedly. From California to England, from Idaho to British Columbia, the warning signs were documented, reported, and ignored. Teachers called, neighbors noticed, family members pleaded, yet in each case, a child died anyway. These weren't failures of individuals alone, but of entire systems that prioritized paperwork over children's lives. What unites these cases isn't just the depravity of the perpetrators, but our collective failure to believe children when they ask for help. Until we fundamentally restructure child protection to put children first, their names will continue to grow into a list no one wants to read. Which systemic failure shocked you the most? And what changes do you think would actually protect vulnerable children? Let me know in your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe for more in-depth true crime coverage that focuses on victims and accountability.